let me say first the high honor I have to be in front of this academy, and I would like also to express my deepest thanks to Pierre-Elena, who very kindly invited me to come today and to make this presentation. I have a PowerPoint, if we could have it. Is it coming? Okay, the presentation is called Unequal World, Unequal Education. I think it says a lot by itself. It says that as the world is unequal, we have a sort of unequal education. Certainly one could say that as education is unequal, the world is unequal. It goes both ways, I suppose. I don't have the where is it to go to the next one? Okay, thank you. Where does it go? Okay, go this way. So this is the overview. The points I would like to make is that education inequalities are increasing everywhere. Would it be between developed and developing countries, first? Second, among developed countries. Third, among developing countries. And the conclusions I would like to draw is that some actions, urgent actions, are needed, and in particular among developing countries, and I would like to propose 3 strands of actions. So let's turn first to inequalities between developed and developing countries. You remember the Education Millennium Development Goals, which were developed in the year 2000, and in particular the one concerning primary education. The objective was to reach by 2015 universal primary education. At that time, in the year 2000, the number of out-of-school children was 17%, and there was quite an impressive result, because by the year 2013, the rate was decreased by more than 45%, that is, it's reached 9.6%. Well, altogether, as we said yesterday, we still have 44.7 million children out of school in primary education. Now, this is an impressive result because at the same time the average in developed countries is 2.7%. So there is a decrease in the inequalities between developed and developing countries if you talk in terms of access. But access is not all. You should not just talk about access, but you should talk also about success, that is quality education. Quality education should be the ultimate goal concerning education. And as you've seen yesterday, quality education is now the goal for the Sustainable Development Goal for education for 2030. And if you look at quality education, in that case, in that area, inequalities are increasing. And they are increasing because of 2 factors. First of all, because we have some risk factors which are exogenous to education, for instance, poverty or conflict situation, and some factors which are endogenous to education, for instance, school accessibility or training years of teachers. Let's look at the first set of factors, the so-called exogenous risk factors. You have a very simple list of such factors: poverty, lack of shelter, illness, child mortality, hunger, lack of water, child labor, conflict situation, human trafficking, single-parent family. We've been talking about all that yesterday. Now, if you look at some, and you know that all those risk factors deeply affect education in many developing countries, only a few developed countries are affected. Remember a few data that we've seen yesterday. Poverty, for instance. 1 billion children live in poverty in developing countries. Illness. The risk of a child dying before 5 in Africa is about 7 times higher than in Europe. Hunger, another dramatic figure. 66 million, 10% primary school-age children attend classes hungry. Child labor, remember the data from yesterday. And conflict situation. Nearly 34 million children live in conflict-affected countries. So exogenous risk factors affecting education, those risk factors affect only developing countries mostly, and not developed countries. If you look at the so-called endogenous factors that are impacting positively the quality of education, here you have a list of 12 factors. If you want to reach quality education in any school in the world, make sure that those 12 factors are implemented. Access to kindergarten, school accessibility, and so on and so forth. I mean, if you take a few examples, for instance, years of initial training of teachers. I've been visiting some schools in Africa. In developed countries, most of the time for primary education, teachers have 3 years of initial training. And for secondary education, they have 5 years of initial training. In Africa, in some countries, they have 3 months, or sometimes less than a year, very rarely more than a year. If you take the case of teaching language different from mother tongue, we've been talking about that yesterday. Curriculum level, the quality of the curriculum is very low in some developing countries, in particular in Africa, while it is very high in developed countries. If we take just another example, access to kindergarten, this is a very good example. We've been talking about PISA yesterday. If you have 1 year or 2 years of kindergarten, this is providing you a very high benefit that is giving you an advantage of 26 or 37 points respectively in PISA when you take the test of PISA at the age of 15. And you should know that 38 points represent 1 year of education. That is, if you have 2 years of kindergarten when you are 4 years, between 4 and 6 years of age, 10 years later, when you take the PISA test, this gives you an advantage of 1 additional year of education. This is quite a very attractive investment. And certainly, as you know, kindergarten is becoming quite prevalent in most OECD countries. It is often limited in developing countries for obvious reasons, because it is quite expensive. So if you look back at this list of endogenous factors impacting positively the quality of education, in many of these factors, most developed countries are making rapid progresses, while developing countries are making slow ones. Hence, inequalities are growing. What does this lead to in terms of level of education? It's nice to talk about inequalities, but what is the difference? What is the end result? Well, again, we can go back to PISA. This is the result of the PISA test in mathematics in 2012. You have the 65 countries that take the test in that year. You have the 65 countries at the bottom. You have the score on the vertical axis from 350 to the top 630. You have the best performing countries on the right and the low performing countries on the left. So I've been singling out 2 countries, Japan, they can see, I don't know if does it work. You have Japan, which is here, and you have Peru, which is here, right? And you have the average OECD countries, which is here, the average performance of OECD countries, which is here at 492. Now, what is interesting is that the OECD average in 2012 was 493 points, and that of developing countries is 406 points. So the difference is, as you can see, is quite important. It is more than 80 points. That represents 2.3 years of education. So when you talk about inequalities between developed and developing countries in terms of education, as an average is 2.3 years of education, right? That's quite important. Let's take the 2 countries, Japan and Peru. So if you have, in Peru, the performance of Japan is 529, that of Peru is 361. That is the difference is 268 points. Remember that for 40 points, that represents a year of education, and therefore 268 points, that's 7 years behind. That is the young Belinda of the age of 15 living in Peru and taking the PISA test. She's 7 years behind in terms of education, and therefore, in order to reach the level of education that a young Japanese fellow of the age of 15 has, she would have to continue staying in class for 7 additional years in Peru to reach the same level. Right. So you see why we talk about education inequalities in the world. Now, the conclusion that we can reach is that unless the two factors, that is the exogenous risk factors, and second, the endogenous education factors, are dramatically changing, the situation will not improve much, apart from a few exceptions. That is, the education inequalities between developed and developing countries will continue to grow. Let's look second in inequalities among developing countries. And again, they are increasing. We can make a difference. Well, first of all, let's quote what the UNESCO is saying. The UNESCO is saying that failing to tackle inequalities have left the world off track to reach the education for all goals by 2015. Let's make the difference between inequalities that can prevail. First, between regions, that is, if you take two examples, one example, Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and second, among a given region between countries. Let's take the example of Africa. Let's take the first one. You've seen that graph yesterday, and you can see that if you take the region in purple, that is Sub-Saharan Africa, you see that between the year 2000 to 2010, the out-of-school children did not decrease much, while in Asia, this out-of-school children number has been decreasing dramatically, right? Now, here are the figures. In Asia, from 2000 till 2013, the number of out-of-primary school children decreased by 69%. In Sub-Saharan Africa, it decreased by 25% only. And inequalities are increasing between the two regions. Now, if you take second inequalities among regions, let's take the example of Africa. And in Africa, you take two countries, Somalia and Congo, and you see the years of education according to the situation of people in rural areas, urban areas, whether you are female or male, or you are very poor or you are very rich. And you can see the big difference that you have between Somalia and Congo according to the situation. And the conclusion that you can reach is that over time, these inequalities can only increase because Congo is growing very rapidly while Somalia is not growing at all, and therefore the inequalities can only increase. So the conclusion that we can reach is that inequalities have a tendency to increase among developing countries. Let's have a look at inequalities among developed countries. Well, again, they are going to increase. Why? Well, in this table, you have, first of all, you have the countries where equity is been increasing and countries where equity has been decreasing. As you can see, this is quite a low number of countries, while here you have quite a large number of countries where equity has been decreasing. What do I mean by that? Well, in fact, equity is measured by the extent to which students' family background or social background impact on their performance. That is, if the family background or social background has an impact on the performance of students, equity is low, and conversely. Now, in 19 out of 27 OECD countries, equity has been decreasing from 2003 to 2012. Therefore, this means that education inequalities has been increasing. At the same time, the number of resident students has been decreasing in the same number of countries. What are they, the resident students? They are students from poor background, but they are performing very well in PISA, that is students from the first income quartile, but with performance in the last quartile. So they are quite performing. This shows what? This shows that education inequalities increased in those countries as schools could not compensate social determinisms. So what are the conclusions we can reach? Well, similar to income inequalities and linked to them, certainly, education inequalities are increasing. They are increasing between developing and developed countries, among developing countries, and among developed countries. And therefore, the urgency is to decrease education inequalities. And in my view, we should start first and foremost in developing countries, because that's where the inequalities, education inequalities, are the most important. Three strands of actions seem necessary. The first one is to limit education inequalities first and foremost, as I said, and we should tackle exogenous risk factors, such as poverty, health problems, hunger, lack of shelter, and child labor. In my view, I think we should start first and foremost to reduce poverty, because poverty seems to be the cause of many problems. This is the cause of health problems, this is the cause of hunger, the cause of lack of shelter and child labor, and so on and so forth. Second, we should tackle intrinsic education inequalities. And if we need to choose a priority, in my view, we should focus on teachers. We always say in the world that the quality of any educational system is equal to the quality of teaching. And therefore, the priority is to recruit and train excellent teachers. If you run a correlation between the quality of educational system in the world and the quality of the teaching forces, you will see that the correlation is very high. Very basic points indeed. Strand 2, if you look at what the UNESCO is saying about international aid, you would be appalled, because the UNESCO is saying that international aid remains inadequate and not well targeted. For instance, if you look at the sub-Saharan Africa, this region is accounting for over half of all out-of-school children, as we have seen, while aid to basic education in the region account for only 33% of the total. And at the same time, primary education is insufficiently supported. Another point which is very important, and we've seen that yesterday, and I've seen that, and we saw that a few minutes ago, the fourth UN Sustainable Development is no longer talking about only access and access limited to primary education, but we are talking about quality education in basic education, that is not primary education until the age of 11, but quality education until the age of 15. And therefore, this requires substantial, extremely substantial additional money, financial resources, and therefore substantial additional international aid. Hence, my conclusion that donors need to raise substantially their aid and support, first and foremost, the poorest countries. The last point is that we should think possibly to develop some aid in kind. Well, for sure, we need to be careful. From my experience, exporting our educational system in some developing countries has proved counterproductive in some cases. We all know that. But however, my conviction is that la main à la pâte seems to be an approach that could help improving performance in some countries. So as you see, those are three basic points. Those are not very fancy conclusions, not very fancy proposals. They are very basic, but if they were implemented, I'm pretty sure that we can decrease education inequalities and the world would be better. Thank you very much.